He thought the divorce was the end of her. That was the first mistake Ethan Whitmore made. By the time the final paper slid across the polished oak table, the conference room already smelled like expensive coffee, printer ink, and victory that belonged to the wrong person. Ethan leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who believed the world had finally returned what it owed him. His attorney adjusted a silver pen, cleared his throat, and began listing the terms in a voice so calm it almost sounded elegant. The house in Westchester, the black Mercedes in the garage, the investment accounts, the art on the walls, the custom furniture. Claire had chosen room by room while Ethan was too busy building the image of success he liked strangers to admire. Everything, every last item was read aloud like a ceremony, and Claire Whitmore sat there without interrupting once. She wore a cream blouse beneath a dark coat, simple gold studs in her ears, her hands folded so still in her lap, they might have belonged to someone waiting for a train instead of watching a marriage get translated into bullet points and signatures. Across from her, Ethan's new girlfriend, seated just outside the glass wall, looked down at her phone and smiled to herself like she had already inherited the future. Ethan noticed that smile and let it feed him. He mistook Claire's silence for defeat because men like him often did. The attorney reached the final line, then paused over one overlooked item, almost too small to matter compared to square footage and bank balances. A wooden box from the study, old walnut about 18 inches wide, brass corners worn dull with age. Claire's eyes moved for the first time. Not to Ethan. Not to the lawyer. To the box listed there in black ink. The movement was slight, barely more than a breath, but it was the only crack in her stillness all morning. Ethan saw it and smiled. He thought he understood. He thought it was sentimental. Some little leftover thing from her father, maybe. Some private attachment he could take just because he could. So when his lawyer asked whether he wanted to include it with the rest of the marital property, Ethan answered before Claire could speak. Yes, he said, with a flat certainty that made the room feel colder. At it. Claire looked at him then, and there was nothing dramatic in her face. No pleading. No anger. No tears brightening her lashes for sympathy. Just a quiet, almost unreadable calm, the kind that made his confidence feel louder than it should have. Then she picked up the pen. The scratch of her signature seemed too soft for what it meant. Ethan signed next, quicker, harder, pressing his name into the paper like he was carving a monument to himself. Chairs shifted. Files closed. The attorney offered his practiced, neutral congratulations. Outside, traffic moved in a slow ribbon through gray afternoon light. Claire stood, slipped her pen back into her bag, and buttoned her coat with steady fingers. Ethan expected one last look, one last argument, one last desperate attempt to reclaim something. But Claire only glanced once toward the wooden box he had just claimed with everything else, and in that single glance was something he could not name. Not sorrow. Not regret. Something quieter. Something final. She walked out of the room carrying almost nothing. Ethan watched her leave and felt 10 feet tall. He did not know that the only thing heavier than what he had taken was what came with it. By sunset, Claire Whitmore was standing in a 500-square-foot rental on the north side of the city, listening to an old radiator click like it had its own private opinion about winter. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint, cardboard, and the coffee shop downstairs that roasted beans before dawn. There was no grand staircase, no marble entry, no custom lighting Ethan had once insisted made a house look important. Just a narrow kitchen with white cabinets, a window over the sink, and enough room for one small table near the glass. It should have felt like loss. Instead it felt honest. Claire set her keys in a ceramic dish by the door and stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. No television in the background. No footsteps from another room. No voice calling her name only when something had gone wrong. She took off her coat, rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, and began opening boxes marked in neat black letters. Mugs. Books. Winter scarves. Office files. Her life had been reduced to labels and tape, but even that felt cleaner than the version she had spent years inside. Across town, Ethan was probably pouring champagne into crystal glasses and calling the day a fresh start. Claire could picture it without trying. He would be standing in the house she had spent 7 years making livable, with his jacket off and his sleeves folded once at the wrist, speaking in that easy confident tone that used to impress strangers at dinner parties. He would say he had made difficult choices. He would say he had paid enough. He would say he deserved peace. And people would nod, because Ethan had always known how to wrap selfishness in language that sounded polished. Claire opened another box and found the framed photo she had not meant to bring. It had been taken on a Cape Cod weekend years earlier, when the ocean had looked silver under a cold morning sky and Ethan had still reached for her hand without checking who was watching. In the photo, she was laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan was looking at the camera like he already understood the value of appearances. Claire studied it for 3 quiet seconds, then slid the picture face down into a drawer. There had been a time when she thought love was built by staying, by smoothing tension before guests arrived, by remembering birthdays on his side of the family, by fixing small disasters before they could touch his schedule. She had learned the florist Ethan preferred, the bourbon his clients drank, the exact tone of apology that made angry partners soften over dinner. She had done it so often that his success began to wear her fingerprints even while his name stayed on everything. At first she told herself that was marriage. Then she told herself it was temporary. Then one afternoon she saw a message flash across his phone while it buzzed against the kitchen counter. And the illusion broke without a sound. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No shattered plates. No screaming. Just one line of text from a woman who thanked him for last night and added a heart as if Claire had already been erased. Ethan walked in 2 minutes later talking about market forecasts, loosened his tie, kissed the air beside Claire's cheek, and never noticed that something in her had gone cold. Months later, when the truth came fully into view, he did what men like him often do. He rewrote the story until he was the one who felt trapped. He called Claire distant. He called the marriage stale. He called himself honest for wanting more. But now, standing in the last clean light of her new apartment, Claire saw the past with a precision she had not allowed herself before. Ethan had not changed all at once. He had simply become more visible. She turned on the lamp beside the sofa, and warm light filled the small room in one steady breath. Then she carried a banker box of documents to the table by the window, sat down, and began arranging folders into careful stacks. Tax records. Property transfer notes. Old estate correspondence. The kind of paper most people ignored until it arrived with consequences. Outside, a siren passed 3 blocks away and faded. Inside, Claire opened her laptop, took one slow sip of coffee gone lukewarm, and began reading line by line. She did not look like a woman rebuilding from ruin. She looked like someone who already knew that not everything taken was truly lost, and not everything won would stay that way. 3 nights later, the wooden box sat on the floor of Ethan Whitmore's study like a quiet dare. It had been left beside the built-in shelves, half hidden by moving blankets and unopened cartons, the brass corners catching the amber light from the desk lamp. The house no longer looked the way Claire had left it. Fresh flowers had been placed in the foyer by someone who did not know which vase belonged there. A scented candle burned in the living room, too sweet for the season, trying to change the mood of a house that still remembered better taste. Soft music drifted in from the kitchen where Lila, Ethan's new girlfriend, stood in one of Claire's old wine-colored sweaters, pouring sparkling water into a stemless glass as if she had always belonged in the room. Ethan noticed none of the details that felt wrong. He only saw the surface. He had spent his whole life confusing ownership with understanding. He loosened the collar of his shirt, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and looked down at the box with the lazy confidence of a man finishing a long day he believed he had one. Lila stepped into the doorway, the glass in her hand catching light. She tilted her head toward the box and smiled. She asked whether that was the one Claire had looked at during the settlement. Ethan gave a small amused shrug and said it was probably family clutter. Maybe old papers, maybe something sentimental she had forgotten to fight for. Lila crouched beside it in her heels anyway, tracing one finger over the brass edge as though it might still turn out to be treasure. She said old things were usually worth more than people realized. Ethan laughed at that, because the irony never even brushed past him. He set his drink down, knelt, and turned the box toward himself. The lock had already been undone years ago. He lifted the lid, expecting dust, maybe letters, maybe the harmless debris of someone else's history. Instead, the first thing he saw was order. Inside were documents arranged in careful stacks. each secured with narrow paper bands browned slightly by age. Beneath them sat a small silver key on a faded ribbon and an envelope with no stamp, no return address. Only one name written across the front in dark blue ink. Claire. Ethan frowned. He had not expected her name to be there like that, private and deliberate. For one strange second he had the sensation of stepping into a room where he had not been invited. Then greed, curiosity, and the habit of entitlement settled him back into place. He picked up the top set of papers and flipped through them, scanning quickly, catching only fragments. Estate. Transfer. Beneficiary. Trustee responsibility. His expression sharpened, then brightened. Lila moved closer and asked what it was. Ethan said it looked important. Valuable, maybe. Complicated in the way wealthy things often were before they became useful. He did not notice the wording that repeated in several places, the language of obligations, liability, succession, review. He saw only the shape of inheritance, the silhouette of advantage. That was all he had ever needed to believe in something. Lila asked whether Claire had known what was in there. Ethan smiled without warmth and said if she had, then she was even more foolish than he thought. He said she had walked away from it just like she had walked away from the rest. But across the city, in the quiet apartment above the coffee shop, Claire sat at her small table with her hair pinned back and her laptop open, reading through scanned records beneath the glow of a single brass lamp. She paused at exactly 9:14 p.m. and looked at the clock, as if she could feel the moment a distance away. Then she closed one folder, opened another and continued. Back in the study, Ethan lifted the envelope with her name on it and turned it over. The seal was unbroken. Lila told him to open it. He slid one finger beneath the flap without hesitation, already smiling at the thought that the final thing Claire had failed to protect might end up being the most valuable piece of all. He still had not learned that the most dangerous things in a room rarely announced themselves when the lid first opened. The letter inside the envelope was only one page, cream-colored, folded with the kind of precision that belonged to an older generation. Ethan opened it carelessly at first, expecting sentiment, maybe one last attempt by Claire to preserve a piece of family history in writing. Instead he found a short note in firm, elegant handwriting from Claire's late father, addressed to her years earlier. It said that if the box had ever reached the hands of a man who valued possession more than meaning, she was to let him keep it. It said the contents would reveal themselves in time, and that greed had a way of signing its own name faster than wisdom ever needed to. Ethan read the lines twice, then let out a quiet laugh that sounded more defensive than amused. Lila asked what it said, and he dismissed it with a flick of his wrist, calling it rich family drama, old money speaking in riddles. But the note had left a small change in the air, one he did not like. He placed it aside and returned to the documents, this time looking more closely, though not closely enough. He saw legal terms he did not fully understand and skimmed past them the way people skim warning labels when the box looks expensive. He noticed the silver key again, heavier than it looked, its teeth cut in an old style, and for a moment his curiosity sharpened into something almost boyish. He asked aloud what it opened. Lila guessed a safe deposit box, maybe an antique desk, maybe some hidden account Claire had been too overwhelmed to pursue. That answer pleased him immediately because it fit the story he preferred. Ethan had always loved any version of events that made him look sharper than everyone else in the room. He stacked the papers on the desk, lifted his bourbon, and began talking through possibilities as if naming them would make them real. If there was an undeclared asset attached to the estate, he said, then it had just become his by settlement. If there was overlooked property, mineral rights, land, some old family trust that Claire had never bothered to untangle, then he had every right to claim it now. He began to sound animated in the way he always did when money and image moved close enough together to flatter him. Lila listened from the edge of the desk, her eyes bright, adding little suggestions that were less about law than luxury. A place in Vermont. A coast house in Maine. Something quiet and exclusive. Something they could restore and photograph and turn into proof that life had rewarded the right people after all. Ethan liked the sound of that. He liked it so much that he missed the paragraph on the second page of the transfer packet that mentioned continuing obligations pending formal review. He missed the references to outstanding claims tied to chain of title. He missed the language that made ownership sound less like a prize and more like a door someone should open very carefully. Across the city, Claire rose early the next morning before sunrise and stood at the window with a ceramic mugworm in both hands. Down below, the barista unlocked the coffee shop and switched on the front lights, one by one, until the street looked less lonely. Claire watched the reflection of her own face in the glass for a moment, then set the mug down and called a number she knew by memory. When the older man on the other end answered, she spoke calmly, asking whether the review had been triggered yet. He told her not officially, but soon. Paper moved slower than consequence, he said, though not by much. Claire thanked him, wrote down the time of the call, and closed her notebook. She did not smile. She did not need to. By mid-morning, Ethan was already on the phone with a private records specialist, asking for a rush search on every document in the box, his voice crisp with confidence, each sentence carrying the same assumption. He still believed that whatever was hidden inside Claire's silence had been meant for the taking. He had not yet understood that some things were only valuable to the person wise enough to leave them alone. By Thursday afternoon, Ethan had turned curiosity into action, which was how most of his mistakes began. He did not know how to leave a mystery alone, especially not one that might be converted into status. The records specialist returned his call just after lunch, while sunlight slanted across the study floor and lit the wooden box as though it were something blessed instead of dangerous. Ethan stood at the window with his phone pressed to his ear, listening as the man on the line explained that several documents in the estate file had already been flagged for historical review, and that one chain of title appeared to connect to an older family holding outside Providence, Rhode Island. That was all Ethan needed to hear. He did not ask why the file had been flagged. He did not pause at the phrase pending review. He only heard location, holding, and family name, and in his mind those words rearranged themselves into opportunity. When he ended the call, he poured another drink even though it was barely 3 o'clock, then walked into the kitchen where Lila sat scrolling through design ideas on her tablet. He told her they might be looking at something bigger than Claire had ever understood. Lila looked up, smiling slowly, and asked how big. Ethan said big enough to matter. Big enough to explain why Claire had stayed so calm. He said it with satisfaction, as if her silence had finally become proof of weakness instead of knowledge. By evening he had already reached out to Martin Keene, a business associate whose talent lay in making complicated things sound manageable for a fee. They met the next morning at a private club in Midtown, where the carpets were thick, the coffee came in white porcelain cups, and men like Ethan liked to discuss ambition in voices softened by money. Martin reviewed copies of the documents at the table, his reading glasses low on his nose, his expression flattening more with each page. Ethan noticed but chose to interpret that seriousness as respect. He asked whether there was value in the file. Martin answered carefully, saying there could be, but the structure was unusual. There were unresolved claims, obligations that had not been fully discharged, and language suggesting that any active holder of the transferred interest could become the formal point of responsibility if a review reopened. Ethan leaned back and smiled as though this were merely the price of entering a more exclusive room. He said responsibility could be managed. Martin did not smile back. He asked whether Ethan had already asserted ownership anywhere in writing. Ethan hesitated, then admitted that he had signed the divorce settlement and submitted one inquiry through a records specialist using his own name. Martin set the papers down more slowly than before. He said that made things less hypothetical. He said Ethan needed to be careful. Ethan heard caution and mistook it for jealousy. He changed the subject, asked about estimated value, and by the time lunch arrived he had already decided that the risk sounded temporary and the reward sounded visible. That night he told Lila they should host something at the house the following week, a proper evening with investors, friends, and a few strategic guests. He wanted people to see that life had moved forward exactly as it should have. He wanted the rooms lit, the piano polished, the bar stocked, the house reclaiming its shine under the right kind of attention. Lila loved the idea immediately. She suggested black candles, white roses, a string quartet near the staircase, and a menu that felt expensive without trying too hard. Ethan approved all of it with the easy confidence of someone building a stage for a version of himself that had not yet begun to crack. Across the city, Claire spent that same evening at her small kitchen table with a legal pad open and a neat line of dates written down the left margin. Her lamp cast a circle of warm light over the papers, and the rain at the window sounded soft enough to ignore. At 8:42 p.m., her phone lit up with a message from the older attorney who had once handled her father's affairs. Review request confirmed, it read. Holder attached. Claire stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down beside her mug. She reached for a pen and added a single note beneath the date. He has started using his name. Then, she closed the pad, rinsed her cup, and turned off the light. She moved through the apartment with the same calm precision she had carried into the settlement room. While miles away, Ethan stood in a bright kitchen making plans for music, glassware, and guest lists, still believing that whatever had begun moving in the dark would arrive dressed as fortune. On Monday morning, the first official notice arrived at Ethan Whitmore's office in a cream envelope marked by a law firm he did not recognize. It was delivered with the rest of the mail, laid neatly beside trade journals, quarterly reports, and invitations he usually opened first. He slid it open with a brushed steel letter opener and expected something minor, some procedural formality tied to the estate records he had already decided would eventually benefit him. Instead, he found language so measured it felt almost cold. Notice of inquiry. Potential assumption of unresolved obligations. Review of fiduciary succession. He read the first page standing up, then the second more slowly, and by the third his coffee had gone untouched long enough to cool. The documents in the box were not a hidden prize waiting for the bold. They were part of an old family structure Claire's father had kept intact for years, because he understood exactly how fragile wealth became when it passed into careless hands. The transferred holding outside Providence was real, but it had been bound to deferred tax exposure, maintenance liability, contested archival claims, and a pending audit tied to decisions made nearly a decade earlier. Whoever formally asserted control did not merely gain access to the asset. That person stepped into every unanswered question attached to it. Ethan read that sentence twice. The office around him remained bright and orderly. His assistant spoke softly on the phone outside the glass wall. A printer hummed in the corner. Midtown traffic moved below in clean lines. Everything looked normal, which only made the paper in his hand feel more offensive. He called Martin at once. Martin answered on the second ring and asked, before Ethan could finish speaking, whether any formal notice had arrived yet. Ethan said yes, his voice flattening with irritation. Martin was quiet for a moment, then said this was exactly what he had warned about. He explained again, slower this time, that the ownership language in the box had never promised clean value. It promised control linked to historic responsibility. The kind that could remain dormant for years until someone ambitious enough or careless enough put his own name on the file. Ethan paced behind his desk, one hand at his hip, staring out at the city as if height itself might restore his advantage. He said there had to be a way to reverse it. Martin replied that reversal was no longer simple because Ethan had not merely inherited documents through settlement. He had activated review by asserting beneficial interest. That phrase landed harder than the rest. Activated review. Ethan felt something shift in his chest then. Not panic exactly, but the first unmistakable edge of being trapped by his own momentum. He ended the call in a controlled voice, but the control cost him more than usual. By evening the house was filled with staff preparing for the party he had refused to cancel. White roses arrived in long rectangular boxes. Crystal glassware flashed under warm lights. Caterers moved in polished shoes through the kitchen Claire used to run with quiet efficiency and no spectacle at all. Lila came downstairs in a silk blouse, asking whether the seating chart still needed work, and Ethan told her everything was fine with a tone sharp enough to stop further questions. She watched him for a moment, her expression tightening just slightly, as if she had begun to sense that the elegant future she had pictured might not be standing on solid ground. Later, alone in the study, Ethan unlocked the drawer and took out the letter from Claire's father once more. This time he read every word. Let him keep it. The contents will reveal themselves in time. Greed signs faster than wisdom ever needs to. The sentence no longer sounded theatrical. Sounded exact. Across the city, Claire was walking home with a paper bag from the corner market tucked against her coat, a loaf of bread under one arm and fresh rosemary peeking out from the top. The night air carried the smell of rain and car exhaust and roasted beans from downstairs. Her phone buzzed once with a brief message from the attorney. First notice served. More to follow. Claire stopped beneath the street lamp outside her building and looked up at the light caught in the wet pavement. Then she put the phone away and climbed the stairs without changing pace. She had not built her peace on the hope that Ethan would suffer. She had built it on the knowledge that truth moved in its own time. And now at last it had begun. By 7:30, the house was glowing like a magazine spread. Candles burned along the entry console in clean rows of black glass. White roses opened beneath low gold light. A quartet played near the staircase, all polished wood and restrained elegance, the kind of music that made people lower their voices as if wealth itself required reverence. Guests drifted through the rooms with champagne in hand, pausing beneath oversized artwork and smiling at Ethan Whitmore, as though he had stepped perfectly into the next chapter of a life designed to impress. He moved among them in a dark suit and a controlled expression, shaking hands, accepting compliments, letting people admire what still looked like success from the right distance. Only once or twice did his focus slip. Once when his phone lit up with a missed call from Martin Keene. Again when he spotted the sealed envelope still sitting in the inside pocket of his jacket, folded there like a warning he had not found a way to silence. Lila remained close to him all evening, elegant in pale satin. Her smile well practiced but tighter than it had been a week ago. She had noticed the mood shift in him. She had noticed the shorter answers, the sudden absences, the way he kept glancing toward the study as though something inside it had teeth. Still the guests did not see that part. They saw crystal, music, tailored confidence. They saw a man hosting his future. Near 8:15, Ethan raised a glass to thank everyone for coming. The room quieted in that easy way rooms do when they are filled with people trained to respond to status. He spoke about new beginnings, about resilience, about the importance of building forward with clarity. The words were polished enough to sound sincere if no one looked too closely. A few guests nodded. Someone laughed lightly at the right moment. Lila touched his arm with her fingertips as if to steady the image of them together. Then the front door opened again. No one noticed at first because another server had just crossed the living room with a tray of champagne flutes. But the temperature of the room seemed to change anyway, not in truth, only in feeling, the way a room shifts when certainty begins to thin. A man in a charcoal overcoat stepped inside with a leather portfolio under one arm, followed by a woman in a navy suit and a second man carrying a slim document case. None of them looked confused. None of them looked impressed by the party. One of the servers hesitated. The quartet continued playing for 3 more measures before losing confidence and fading into silence. Ethan lowered his glass. He knew that kind of entrance. He had made people feel it before. The man in the overcoat asked for him by full name. His voice calm enough to turn every nearby conversation into stillness. Guests glanced over shoulders. Martin, who had arrived late and was standing near the bar, closed his eyes for one brief second like a man who had just watched a prediction become visible. Ethan stepped forward with a smile that no longer reached the rest of his face. He said this was a private event. The man nodded once and replied that the matter was time-sensitive. He presented formal notice tied to an active review of fiduciary succession and associated obligations now attached to Ethan as the declared holder of record. The words did not need to be understood by everyone in the room. They only needed to sound official. And they did. Lila's hand slipped from Ethan's arm. A couple near the piano looked away, then back again, unable to decide which version of politeness mattered more. Ethan took the papers, but his fingers did not close cleanly around them. He asked whether this could wait until morning. The woman in navy answered that several inquiries had already matured into formal action, and that immediate acknowledgement was required. Immediate. Formal. Holder of record. Each phrase landed in the room like a light turning on where no one wanted it. Ethan felt the eyes on him then, not admiring now, only measuring. For the first time all evening, the house no longer looked like proof of his control. It looked staged. Temporary. Borrowed from a version of himself that was beginning to come apart. And somewhere beneath the shock and the humiliation, another realization started to rise, slow and cold. Claire had known. Not because she had set out to destroy him, but because she had recognized the difference between a gift and a burden long before he ever opened the box. Ethan stood in the center of his own party with legal papers in his hand, and a room full of witnesses pretending not to listen. The music had stopped. The candles still burned. And the silence around him no longer felt expensive. It felt earned. No one announced Claire when she arrived. The front door opened, and she simply stepped inside as if silence had made room for her on purpose. She wore a black coat over a soft gray dress, nothing loud, nothing designed to compete with the room. Yet every candle seemed to sharpen when she crossed the threshold. Rain had left a faint shine on the front walk outside, and for one brief second the cold air followed her in, clean and steady, cutting through the perfume, the wine, the heat of too many people pretending not to stare. Claire paused just inside the foyer and removed her gloves with calm, unhurried hands. She did not look around to measure the room. She did not search for sympathy. Her gaze found Ethan almost at once. He was still standing near the center of the living room with the legal papers in one hand, the confidence gone from his posture even though he was trying hard to keep the outline of it. Around him, conversations had fractured into low, unfinished whispers. The quartet remained still near the staircase, bows lowered. Lila stood 2 steps back now, close enough to be seen beside him, far enough to avoid being mistaken for part of the problem. The woman in the navy suit turned toward Claire first, recognizing her from the estate records. She asked, in a tone meant for business but heard by everyone, whether Claire Whitmore would be willing to confirm the transfer history attached to the disputed holding. Ethan looked at Claire then with something rawer than anger. Confusion certainly. Humiliation, yes. But underneath both was the first fragile edge of understanding. Claire moved forward across the polished floor, her heels making almost no sound. She stopped beside the console table where black candles burned in their glass sleeves, and set her gloves down neatly on the marble surface. Then she faced the woman from the law firm and answered with the same composure she had carried into the divorce room weeks before. "Yes," she said. "I can confirm it." Her voice was low, clear, and free of triumph. She explained that the wooden box and all associated contents had been awarded to Ethan as part of the final settlement. She stated that he had accepted full possession voluntarily, and that he had since asserted his interest using his own name. Nothing in her tone accused him. Nothing in her face asked the room to punish him for what he had done. She was not there to perform injury. She was there to tell the truth and leave it standing on its own. One of the attorneys asked whether she had understood the obligations tied to the file before the transfer took place. Claire held the woman's gaze and said yes. She had understood them for years. Her father had preserved the holding carefully, not because it was worthless, but because its value could not be separated from its burdens. The room grew quieter with each sentence. Ethan swallowed once, then asked the question before he could stop himself. He asked why she had not said anything. Claire turned to him at last. The house around them, every polished surface and flower arrangement and dimmed lamp, seemed to wait with her. When she answered, her words were simple enough to wound without cruelty. She said he had never wanted understanding. He had wanted ownership. And those were not the same thing. Lila looked down at the floor. Martin said nothing at all. The candles continued to burn with indifferent elegance while the shape of the evening changed completely. Ethan glanced at the paper in his hand, then back at Claire as if he might still find some hidden rescue in her expression. But there was no rescue there. Only clarity. Claire picked up her gloves, thanked the attorney for her time, and turned toward the door. No one tried to stop her. No one knew what to say. She had entered the room without force and undone the illusion anyway. Behind her stood the man who had taken everything he could touch. Before her was the doorway, the rain-cooled air, and a night that belonged to her because she no longer needed anything from the house at all. Claire stepped out into the night, and the door closed behind her with a softness that felt more final than any slammed goodbye ever could. The rain had thinned to a silver mist, light enough to gather on her coat without asking permission. She stood on the front walk for one quiet second, breathing in the cold air, listening to the faint muffled sound of voices still trapped inside the house she had once arranged flower by flower, season by season, dinner by dinner, while Ethan mistook her care for something that would always remain available to him. Now the windows behind her glowed gold against the dark, beautiful from the outside, brittle on the inside. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, its headlights brushing over wet pavement and low hedges trimmed too perfectly for comfort. Claire walked toward the curb with steady steps, her heels tapping softly against the stone, each one carrying less weight than the last. Inside the house, Ethan remained exactly where she had left him, the legal papers still in his hand, though his grip had loosened enough for one page to bend at the corner. Guests were beginning to leave in careful clusters, murmuring polite excuses, avoiding direct eye contact the way people do when a downfall has arrived dressed too well to interrupt. The quartet had packed away their instruments. The roses still stood in expensive arrangements no one was admiring anymore. Lila had disappeared upstairs without a word. Martin Keene remained near the bar with the posture of a man who knew better than to offer comfort where pride had caused the damage. Ethan looked around the room as if searching for one thing that still belonged entirely to him. But ownership had become a different kind of word now. The house felt altered. Not because Claire had returned to claim it, but because the illusion that had filled it had gone out like a light. He thought of the settlement table, of the pen in his hand, of the wooden box he had taken with such casual certainty. He thought of Claire's face that day, calm and unreadable, and understood at last that silence had not been surrender. It had been restraint. It had been knowledge. It had been the last mercy she allowed him before he chose his own lesson. Outside, Claire reached the sidewalk and drew her coat closer at the collar. Her phone buzzed once in her bag with a message from the attorney, likely another update, another procedural step in a process now moving exactly where it had always been heading. She did not reach for it yet. Above the coffee shop waiting for her across town, a lamp would still be on near the window. Her small kitchen would smell faintly of rosemary and clean dish soap. Tomorrow morning, the barista downstairs would unlock the front door before sunrise, and the street would wake in its ordinary way, as if not every kind of victory needed witnesses. Claire lifted her face into the cool mist and let it settle there for a moment. She had not won Ethan back. She had not taken revenge with noise, spectacle, or ruin of her own making. She had simply stepped aside and let truth meet the man who believed everything could be possessed if he reached for it first. At the end of the drive, a black town car pulled up to the curb. Claire opened the rear door, then paused once more before getting in. She looked back only briefly at the lit windows, the polished front door, the life that had once seemed too large to leave. From this distance it already looked smaller. Then she slipped into the car, and the door shut with quiet certainty. The driver pulled away. Behind her, Ethan Whitmore still stood in the center of a house full of things. Ahead of her, the city opened in clean ribbons of light. She had not walked away empty-handed. She had walked away with herself.